the only way capitalism can exist. Capitalism's goal, I'm not Karl Marx. I'm a 31-year veteran of the United States Army. Capitalism's goal is monopoly, destruction of labor, building a product at the least possible cost, making it as shoddy as possible, and selling it at maximum cost. That's capitalism's goal. Anyone who studies it knows that. I mean, that's what the profit margin, the market's all about. Adam Smith wrote more about morality than he did economics. And go back and read some of the things he wrote about morality. People today wouldn't even know what he was talking about. So the way you check that predatory aspect of capitalism and keep it in balance is with powerful labor unions representing the interest of labor and good, solid, well-executed, implemented, and overseen government regulation. We've done away with both of those. We have a pittance of labor unions, and we have destroyed the regulation. And my political party, the Republicans, want to get rid of the rest of it. You know another country that's done exactly the same thing? Get ready for this if you don't know it. Israel. Israel started out as a communist state. Why? Because of all the communists persecuted by Hitler flowing out of Europe and into Palestine. Kibbutzes, communes, that was Israel. It was a socialist state. Israel is now the most predatory state in the world of capitalism. 60 Israeli families own about 80% of Israel. The security complex in Israel owns or leases 51% of the land. There are no labor unions anymore, and the Knesset has passed so many laws in the last couple of years under Bibi Netanyahu that it is no longer really a democracy. And we are tied to that state at the hip, at the shoulder, and at the ankle bone. You talk about being dragged into apocalypse in some biblical fashion, there's a recipe for it right there. And what is Netanyahu doing right now? He's trying to cause the Palestinians and the Arabs in general to start another intifada so that he can massacre them. I can't put it any more clearly or manifestly. That's what he's trying to do. And guess whose bombs he's going to kill those women and children with? Yep, Gideon Levy said the other day, I want to show you a film. I'll show you this film. I'll show you these little children being killed in Gaza. Don't you think for a minute that just Israel is guilty. You made that bomb, and you sold that F-16. He was right. So that's why I say we're slip sliding into hell. And we got a leader who's going to take us right there. And if we don't get our populist act together, or whatever it happens to be, I don't care if it's a bunch of academics from William and Mary. And we don't take our government back in a meaningful and dramatic way. I'm not talking about, one or two senators or one or two cops. I'm talking about throwing every single one of them out. There are some good people up there, like Angus King, independent from Maine. I worked for Bernie Sanders for a little while. I think his heart's in the right place. So, you go get reelected. If you're good, go get reelected. But otherwise, throw them out. And then throw them out again if they don't do what we want them to do. And we've got to restructure. We simply have to restructure. Academics have been saying this for a long time. Government specialists, functional specialists, administrative management specialists have been saying this for a long time. Even some of the national security elite have been saying this for a long time because, for example, Colin Powell goes and testifies to 8 committees. Why does he have to testify to 8 committees for his budget? Because they all want a piece of the pie. And that way the pie can be spread out so that people can't audit it very well, and the American people really lose track of how much is actually being spent. And that's the State Department. Donald Rumsfeld used to say to Colin Powell, you don't get as much money as I lose every year. He was right. In that particular fiscal year that he said that, defense couldn't show to the Congress $45 billion. That's why the Congress finally said, audit your damn books. And they haven't yet. That year, state got $28 billion. And I'll tell you something else. The discretionary money state got was about $6.5 billion. That is to say, money that they could spend on something that wasn't earmarked for. Guess what happened to that $6.5 billion? $3 billion went to Egypt automatically to keep the peace treaty with Israel, and $3 billion went to Israel to buy more arms. So we had about maybe 400,000 or 500,000 to do foreign policy. And it's worse under Tillerson. It's so bad under Tillerson that I believe that Trump told Rex Tillerson, go to state and dismantle diplomacy. Go to state and dismantle that instrument of national power called diplomacy. And now what you're seeing, after Tillerson's been there for a while, he's not an idiot, is he's pushing back because he realizes, not as much as he should, but a little bit, that what state does in the world is crucial to America's future. So he's pushing back. One wonders how much and how long he's going to be able to do that. But his instructions, I'm quite confident, were take care of that, as Richard Nixon said, that bunch of commie pinko fags over there at state. That's pretty incredible when you consider George Washington's emphasis in the beginning. The protocol standard setter was, after all, George Washington. His emphasis on his state, his Secretary of State, his emphasis on everything from the Jay Treaty and the neutrality he effected so that we didn't get sucked into either the British or the French side of those two empires fighting. An incredible battle there, of course, in order to do that. The French even dispatched Citizen Genet to the United States to go around Washington and plead for Americans to join France and screw their president. These were troubled times, too. In fact, I sometimes compare the danger of that period with today. I think we have never been in such mortal peril since the Revolution. Think about that for a minute. Think about if you were one of those people. When you said, and to these ends we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, the last words of the Declaration of Independence. When they said that, their greatest expectation was to be hanging from the yardarm of a British warship dead. They were saying that to the greatest empire in the world with the most powerful navy the world had seen in 2,000 years. That took some cojones. That took some courage. Jefferson showed how perhaps frightened he was when as governor of Virginia and the British made a landfall in Virginia, he escaped to the mountains real quick. In fact, he got excoriated for it. He was called a coward because he just unasked the place. He was scared to death. He knew he'd be killed. He knew he was what did George III call us? In English? Yes. Terrorists. George III called us terrorists and traitors, and we were. We were. And most historians now agree that at least a small majority, if not as much as 55-60% of Americans were Tory sympathizers, if not outright Tories, especially in New York and Boston, the two really powerful centers. And so, I mean, these guys were really taking it. They were going out on a limb. Do we have anybody who'd even think about that today in the Congress of the United States? I listened to Lindsey Graham the other day from my home state. Lindsey Graham made the most reprehensible, disgusting remarks I think I have heard come out of a senator's mouth since Tom Cotton got elected. Lindsay, who is usually somewhat circumspect, said, this is no joke. He said, now don't worry about it, Americans. The war will be on the Korean Peninsula. There'll be no fighting here. 230,000 Americans live in the greater Seoul area, Lindsay. I know because I used to have to do the F-77 report collection for U.S. Think PAC so that we could do a non-combatant evacuation operation in the event of implementation of war plans. And I was stunned the other day when I used the figure that was from that time, and I go back a ways, 110,000, and somebody said laughingly, are you out of date, boy? It's 230 now. 230,000 Americans live in the Seoul area. Not only that, of 48 million South Koreans, over 60% live in the greater Seoul area. The most dangerous place to live if 10,000 artillery pieces are going to shoot about 30 rounds each on your bod at BMNT on Monday morning. Do you know what 30,000 artillery rounds do? Check out Passchendaele, Ypres, Verdun, the Somme. This is what we're talking about. And Lindsey Graham says, don't worry, Americans, because the war will be contained to the peninsula. What about our South Korean allies? What about the most modern, technical, arguably democratic, liberal city in the world, Seoul, Korea? Unconscionable remarks. And yet, I'll bet there aren't 5 Americans who heard Lindsey Graham say that who didn't breathe a sigh of relief, at least momentarily, because they thought, well, the war will be there. That's the state we're in today. That's where we are. And this president is nothing but an aider and abetter of that sort of state and scares me to death. I never watched media news. I just left it. I canceled the Washington Post. I read the London Financial Times. I go online, find my own sources. The FBI sends me things. CIA sends me things. State sends me things. I read them selectively. But I've started watching the stupid media in the mornings because I want to find out just how frightened I should be from what the president said the night before. You have no idea how difficult it is living cheek and jowl with this idiot and the team around him. If you've watched me on MSNBC or some of the other places where I've talked, I've called them a team of amateurs. And I even include in that Jim Mattis, John Kelly, and H.R. McMaster, all of whom I've known for some time. Remember, I was deputy director and director of the Marine Corps War College, 1993 to 1997. That's when they were majors and lieutenant colonels. I was there at the National Defense University when H.R. as a major presented his dissertation that later became Dereliction of Duty, LBJ, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the lies that led to Vietnam. I watched H.R. give his briefing, and the lieutenant general retired on my left become apoplectic in a way that I knew was going to burst forth when H.R. finished and went to Q&A. And sure enough, as soon as he stopped and Q&A started, this lieutenant general stood on his feet and said, "How dare you call Maxwell Taylor, who was a good, dear friend of mine and an outstanding patriotic American, a liar." And he sat back down, and H.R. then proceeded with document after document after document, phone call after phone call, memorandum after memorandum to devastate this general. So much so that this son of a bitch shrunk beside me. H.R. just murdered him. Maxwell Taylor lied to the president, lied to the Joint Chiefs, and lied to the American people. And they're still lying today, and you want me to be comfortable because those 3 generals are in the White House? And John Kelly, God rest his soul, goes to the Coast Guard Academy and gives a speech and says that George Washington's oath in New York was extemporaneous almost because they had to put it together before he took it. And since we'd had oaths only to sovereigns, we had nothing that would apply, so they had to write it on the spot. The oath is in Article 2 of the Constitution of the United States. John? And he also spread that apocryphal evangelical Christian story about George Washington, adding at the end, so help me God, he did not. Every historian who has looked into it, written about it, says that's not true. And if you know anything about George Washington, you know that he rarely, if almost ever, said Jesus Christ, or he said divine providence. He said Almighty God. He said things like Masons were used to saying in those days. He said things like people who believed in some sort of supernatural force but didn't think it came down and dictated everything you did every day, and certainly didn't dictate you be a fundamentalist Christian, who have a different Bible than mine. This is John Kelly, the Chief of Staff in the White House. This is a team of rank amateurs confronting some of the greatest challenges that America has ever confronted at a time that is perilous, dangerous, fraught with underlying challenges in the world. And not the least of these is one coming down the track like your proverbial freight train called climate change. I belong to a group called the Climate Security Working Group in Washington, which is a quasi-DOD group. Admirals and generals sit with us, especially admirals who know something about the oceans. And we talk all the time about Norfolk, Virginia, for example, which is going to be underwater shortly. You know, that's our shipyards on the eastern seaboard. That's where aircraft carriers call and so forth. We're looking at a $40, a $60, an $80 billion bill maybe to build walls or to relocate. And the Homeland Security guy down there told me the other day, he said, you know, there's 14 political jurisdictions down there, and I can't get them to decide on what they want to do. And the military sitting there, the Navy in particular, saying, make up your minds, civilians, because if you're going to relocate, we have to relocate. If you're going to build walls, we have to help you. And this is a president who has a EPA administrator and has himself on occasion said it's all a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. The Chinese probably love that. This is crazy. We did a simulation. I'll end on this. I know it's been awfully negative. We did a simulation in conjunction with the Center for Naval Analyses, some real experts in oceans. And we hired with volunteers, as you might suspect, from Germany, from France, from China, from Japan, from Korea, from other countries. We concentrated on what we call the peer powers, which sort of runs from Tokyo through Washington, across London and Berlin, and into Beijing and Moscow. And we hired academics, former generals, former heads of state, and ministers of state and so forth, to play these simulations over 2 years. We did them in Delhi, Beijing, and Washington. In 2065, in one iteration of these simulations, fairly realistic, I thought, in 2065, the peer powers, after having spent a decade and a half trying to handle the migrations that take place, hundreds of millions of people with no water to drink, no food to eat, 50% of them male, 50% of that 50% under 35, with a Kalashnikov and 20 rounds of ammunition, probably we sold it to them, are coming. We're not talking about the people coming across from Libya into Europe or coming across from the Syrian diaspora into Turkey and Europe. We're talking about 200 million people. After 10, 15 years of trying to handle this in a humanitarian way, the peer powers stop. And they build walls and put machine guns on top of them. And they start shooting people. Which was kind of interesting because about that time we got the briefing on that simulation, Trump had just been elected and said he was going to build a wall. There were some eerie thoughts in the room that day. One of the Germans, young man, jumped up and said, you can't tell me, to the game briefer, you can't tell me that European decision makers participated in that. And he read off the names of the 3 Germans who had participated in the simulation. Young man sat down. Pretty prominent Germans. I'm not saying that's going to happen. What I'm saying is that your military is doing simulations with other militaries around the world and civilians to look at the potential that climate change presents, because they know ultimately they're going to pay a huge price for it. I was in Aceh, Indonesia with Colin Powell in 2005 after the tsunami. Powell said, this looks like what a nuclear landscape would look like. It looks like what Hiroshima and Nagasaki probably looked like. That's what Aceh province looked like. You saw 65-foot fishing boats hung up in trees that had been 2 days before 65 kilometers the other way in port. 230,000 people died. I didn't exaggerate. 230,000 people died. That's coming. It's coming, and the military knows it. It knows that those kinds of events are going to happen with 7 or 8 times the frequency they have in the past, and they're going to be called out to do disaster relief and provide humanitarian assistance just as they did in Aceh province, Indonesia. They know that's going to kick their budget up, $60 to $70 billion. They know that Congress is probably not going to give them that. They're going to have to take it out of hide. So yes, it's enlightened self-interest, but it's the military doing the work on climate change in Washington. Isn't that something? Oh, by the way, when the Air Force tried a little experiment and put 15, 20% ethanol in their F-15s and F-16s in the avgas, Congress told them to stop because that was a threat to the fossil fuel industry. And one congressman said, it's an admission that climate change is a problem. Can you imagine that? And I'll close with this kind note about one congressman who looked at me, who happens to be the chairman of a committee involved in science and technology, when I was talking to him about a totally unrelated matter, Cuba, and travel to Cuba. He just remarked to me, because I had somehow gotten into geology and said the Earth was 4.5 billion years old. He looked back at me and said, no, it's not. It's 6,243 years old. And I have that from the Bible. And I looked at my colleague who was there with me to sort of lobby this guy, and I winked an eye like, let's get out of here. We're wasting time. That's your Congress. That's your Congress. When I was in Texas, speaking with the head of the Texas legislature, the Speaker of the Texas House, about a carbon neutral tax and a market solution to some of Texas's problems. Texas is the biggest polluter in the country, outside of California and New York, and you got to do the figures, but Texas is about the biggest polluter. But it has done a marvelous job of bringing that pollution down. I've got to give them credit for that. But he wanted to know about this because it was market-based. He's a Republican, it was market-based, and he saw that, you could do it and not hurt the economy. He said, you got to go talk to Senator Cornyn, Joe Cornyn, in Washington. So we ran right over to the federal building, and we did a secure video teleconference with Cornyn's staff in Washington and told them we were coming, we being the Climate Security Working Group. We went over there, and guess who Senator Cornyn put in front of us? One staffer who took copious notes, but we tried to connect it with national security because they had told us Joe will listen if it's national security. And so now we finally got a few Republicans signed up to a caucus, a climate change caucus, a few Republicans signed up to a resolution and so forth, but it's like picking teeth. I mean, they just do not want to admit that this is potentially an existential challenge for not just the United States, but for the globe. After going to 5 years of these briefings, I think unmistakably it's an existential challenge. What we don't know is just how fast and furious it's going to come on. But the computer models so far have been wrong when they're wrong in our disfavor, not our favor. In other words, they've said this is going to happen such and such a time, and it's either already happening or it's accelerating majorly, like Arctic ice melt and so forth. going to be a bad time, and we need to be doing something about it. I hesitate to think that we're going to do anything about it right now, or in the foreseeable future that's significant enough to make a difference. I will close, though, by saying in the states I've been in, like Iowa and Texas and others, what I'm finding is, because either the market pressures are there, as in Iowa, or good leadership is there, as in Texas in this one case, it's happening despite Washington. So you've got states like Iowa that are already 50 to 60% off the grid, mostly with wind and solar. Texas is moving rapidly in that direction too. So you've got the states doing these things. That's another measure, though, of possible dismemberment. If the states get angry enough and powerful enough to where they just tell Washington to go to hell. And wow, you would not believe the number of legislatures and states and others who kind of said that to me. So I'll close on that, and we don't have time for questions or anything, do we? Nope. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel Wilkerson. In appreciation, we'd like to present you with this little plaque here that says, well, I was going to read it, but I don't have my glasses.
Glasses.
So this is from Veterans for Peace, presented by Veterans for Peace to Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson as an expression of our appreciation for your participation in our 2017 annual convention and your outstanding leadership, service, and dedication to peace. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.